A second domain of the research concerns the role of institutionalization of cultural memory in museums, galleries, and libraries in defining, building national identity in historical and contemporary perspectives. The peculiarities of museums and libraries in the organization of collections and contents established over the centuries is a prerequisite to defining their possible evolution and adjustment to fulfill new demands and needs in contemporary age of migrations. Starting from the well-known Michel Foucault essay in which he back to the category of heterotopias of indefinitely accumulating time, other places where it's practiced, the idea of accumulating everything, establishing a place for each time that is out of time itself, inaccessible to its own corruption, we recognize that history of museums and libraries is typically all Western, like the history of science and technology, for example. And as such, it is reflected in concepts that are well established since the birth of scientific and industrial revolution: progress, universalism, positivism, the dualism between culture and civilization. These concepts have acted in society, in cognitive and pedagogical activities, in a production, Western ideology and rhetoric, and in a general philosophy of history that has defined the terms of the substantive centrality of the debate on the Western culture, in the theoretical practical processing of the institutions responsible for the preservation and transmission of knowledge and ideas. In particular, museums and libraries, part of the so defined by Tony Bennett exhibitionary complex, referring particularly to 19th century museums and libraries, have always had a special role in establishing the values of the public sphere. Values that have changed from the aristocratic society first, the nationalistic middle class later, and the contemporary mass society today, a condition that is progressively more recognizable in the cultural as well ethnic melting pot we see as a process going on in these years. But as it happens for the majority of the expressions of contemporary society, museums does not represent anymore a unitary or monolithic reality. The exhibitionary complex has actually changed its paradigms and its functionalities. As Jan Pieterse says, national identity was constructed in history museums and national art galleries and military and war museums. Imperial identities were produced in colonial and ethnographic museums and displays, while modern identities have been staged in world exhibitions, science, and modern art museums. Today's museum system is articulated, multifaceted, a real mirror of contemporary societies. We have great national historical museums, traditional art museums, but also different kinds of contemporary art museums, scientific museums of ancient foundation, and very new and experimental science centers. There are thematic or monographic museums, museums of community, religious or ethnic societies, museums in and about territory, eco-museums, and so on. Museum today stops being a local phenomenon and becomes a worldwide phenomenon, with related cultural crisscrossing and interferences with other cultural institutions and activities. According to International Committee of Museums, today in the world there are about 55,000 museums in 202 countries. There were 35,000 in 1990, with a growth of 63% in 20 years. The increasing importance in the world, especially in Europe and the United States, of the market of culture, travel, itinerancy among places and knowledge, study and research has led to a proliferation of museums and to the sharpening of the problem of memory and its preservation, so that we can talk today of musealization of nearly every phenomenon of humanity, as Victoria Newhouse envisioned already in 1988. Here, for example, we see the site of the first A-bomb test in 1945 in New Mexico. The test was led by Robert Oppenheimer, the physical. Now it's a USA National Historical Landmark. Moreover, the pervasiveness of the institution of museum in society means that we tend to recognize in museums factors of identification that had traditionally been entrusted to other public or private institutions. By doing so, every cultural, ethnic, religious group, every local reality, every village wants to build their own museum. It seemed as if museums were collective houses in which all of us can mirror between memory and cultural identity. Third important domain of the research concerns museums and libraries' missions, curatorial practices, exhibition and museum design in the context of our forthcoming complex hybrid, multicultural and overnational Europe. Museums are currently at the core of an important process of institutional transformation. The most important institutional transformation of the museum apparatus in recent times is maybe the one that sees museums having changed their nature of privileged place for conserving and exposing things to a new powerful medium of social communication, or as it has been defined, a new media, or a meaning maker, or a storyteller. At the same time, the concept of museums as a collective place has become increasingly consolidated in a context like the current one, where the museum forms an articulated dimensions of social leisure enjoyment, so that museum users are no longer just academics, clerics, and amateurs, or enthusiasts, visitors, no more reformatory of manners or places or civilizing rituals. Museum values have shifted from moral lessons to entertainment and mass use. Frank Werner, in 1987, talking about the first museum boom in Germany, wrote of 60 million leisure-hungry visitors kitted out with gym shoes that assail the museums of the German Federal Republic every year in search of recreation amidst artistic and architectural scenery of increasing refinement. This has become the condition of cultural consumption in these years, in which different publics of visitors means different cultures, but also that museums are placed for the curious, tourists and flaneurs who consider museums as meeting places. These people go to museums to browse in the bookshop, participate to conferences or other events, and eventually, but not for sure, to visit exhibition rooms. The crux around which rotates their thinking of the way of being of museums and libraries as cultural institutions and repositories of the memory and identity of the past history is the altered, widened, diversified relationship with all the visitors, with a catchment area that goes beyond the narrow context of every town, university, campus, village, region, or nation to expand to a supranational and global scale. This happens in an increasingly complex intersection of interests, languages, cultures, desires, expectations. Selfness and otherness are constantly on the table when the message and the communication of issues of knowledge in exhibitions becomes the narratives, the discourses that every exhibition brings to the public sphere. Multi-layered society has shattered the concept of public, but also, I think, that of publics, as we used to say today. Today, probably, we have only visitors, single personalities, one different from the other, with their own identities, interests, aesthetic dimensions, a cognitive dimension in interpreting museum exhibitions. Every visitor is a public that sees the museum differently from the other. Cultural studies and contemporary museum studies in the last 25 years have produced a large amount of important reflections about the topics we are briefly outlining here. You can see some concepts and keywords that are part of the general discourse on the theme, even though fundamentally linked to the English-speaking countries where there are consolidated research groups in the University of Social and Cultural Studies. In Italy, for example, we mirrored very few of this theoretical elaboration. Very few translations have been done even of the most important of the books published there, with the exception, for example, of the Club editors in Bologna that have, under the direction of Freddy Druckmann, edited in Italian the well-known first two books by Ivan Karp, Exhibiting Cultures, and the other one, Museums and Communities. Even though in Italy we have a very rich tradition in terms of theory and practice in the field of museology and curatorship, and particularly museography and museum architectural design. Being all these publications in Italian language, they are almost all unknown to English and American scholars. And this is this is part of the work we will be devoting in strengthening mutual communication between different speaking areas, because we think we have to do more intertwining cultural research about our themes.